There's audio, right?
Very small.
Um,
Yeah, it's working.
in here. Oh, yes. Okay. Okay. Everyone will be starting now. So good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our lectures and planning series this fall with Professor Patrick Heller of Brown University. My name is Vinita, and I'm a PhD student in urban planning at GSAP, and I will be moderating the session today. So the lecture will happen for close to an hour, to which we'll have time for questions from the audience. I will be coordinating the Q&A with attention to diversity and inclusion. So to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will call you. Just a note that today's session will be recorded, so please keep that in mind. And with that, we are very delighted to welcome our speaker for the day, Professor Patrick Heller, who is the Lynn Cross Professor of Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology and International and Public Affairs. He's also the Director of Development Research Program at Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. Professor Heller's main area of research is the comparative study of social inequality and democratic deepening. He's the author of The Labor of Development, Workers in Transformation of Capitalism in Kerala, India, and co-author of Social Democracy and the Global Periphery, Bootstrapping Democracy, Transforming Local Governance and Civil Society in Brazil, and most recently, Deliberation and Development, Rethinking the Role of Voice and Collective Action in Unequal Societies. Professor Heller has published articles on urbanization, comparative democracy, social movements, development policy, civil society, and state transformation. His most recent project, Cities of Delhi, conducted in collaboration with Center for Policy Research, explores the dynamics of governance and social exclusion in India's capital. So please join me in welcoming Professor Patrick Heller.
I have 45 minutes. 50 for the
Yes,
talk.
45.
Okay. So let me begin by thanking Vinita. She organized all of this, and it's so wonderful to be here. I actually taught at Columbia a long, long time ago, and this is my first time back on campus, and it's first time I needed ID and QR code. It's a little, shocking. In any event, thank you to the school for having me, and thank you for all being here today. So today I want to do, in the time that I have, three things. I want to talk in the most general terms about the challenges of promoting more inclusive forms of development in the big mega cities of the global South. And those challenges are quite enormous. I then want to present some evidence from 20 years of field work and multiple different team-based projects gathering data on urban governance in Brazil, India, and South Africa. And in that evidence, try to make the case that Brazil has actually made a significant amount of progress in the last 3 decades, that South Africa, post-apartheid, had some quite extraordinary opportunities to make cities more inclusive, but has largely failed to do so, and that Indian cities continued to be very weak in terms of their governance capacity, and as a result have made very little progress in terms of advancing inclusion. And the third thing I want to do is make the comparative political sociology argument for why Brazil has done better than the other two. So that's the agenda. I've got a lot of slides, a lot of data. I'm gonna, because it's 3 cases and a lot of material, I'm gonna go quite rapidly, but if you want to come back in Q&A to any of the slides, any of the data, I will of course be extremely happy to do that. And now the keyboard is, oh, here it is. All right, so let me begin by framing this in terms of the larger literature. So, you know, the urban question has been with us for a long time. It's probably more urgent today than it's ever been. The big change of the past 30 years has been a globalization. There's some of you, you're studying urban planning. I'm sure you're familiar with Saskia Sassen's work or Neil Brenner and his collaborators. And they've all argued that increasingly what cities can and can't do is a function of their role as these critical nodes in the global economy as centers of accumulation. And one of the problems associated with that, there's a lot of problems. The biggest problem, arguably, is just the extent to which land values in the global south have exploded. So 30, 40 years ago, pre-globalization, pre the extraordinary mobility of global capital, land values were more or less aligned with levels of national economic development. Today, they're completely misaligned. So Mumbai, and I'll show you some data on this, is on a per square foot basis, one of the most expensive cities in the world, despite the fact that half the population lives in slums, right? So prices have just exploded. And as a result, I argue that the default option for governance in cities of the global south today is the famous growth machine. And the growth machine is a term that Harvey Mollich and John Logan developed in the context of the US. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the logic behind the growth machine is pretty straightforward. It's the idea that developers work with officials, politicians, bureaucrats to maximize the returns to their investments in land, to maximize exchange value over use value, as Mollich and Logan used to put it. And as a result, this is the dominant logic of cities in the United States. To push growth, to push the maximization on returns from scarce land, which is urban land. And as a result, there's a relative neglect of policies of inclusion, right? So you're developing a lot of land and housing, but it tends to be for, you know, those who can afford it, et cetera. And the infrastructure is geared to growth, not so much inclusion. And I would argue that this has become the default regime in the global south. And there are other problems. Some of you may be familiar with Mike Davis's Planet of Slums, which was a very provocative, important book about 20 years ago. And he wrote it just as the world had passed the 50% mark. We're now more than 50% urban. And he argued that urbanization now is a real challenge because we're in a post-industrial economy. Since 2001, the world has been, in terms of employment, deindustrializing, right? We've become so much more efficient with automation, et cetera, at producing things that manufacturing is increasingly less a source of employment than it was in the past. And the great cities of the world today, as we know them, that grew up in the Fordist periods, were manufacturing cities, right? People were drawn to these cities because there were jobs, often good jobs, union jobs, jobs with benefits, et cetera. That's pretty much gone. And what we have is a lot of growth. I mean, India has been growing 7-8% for the last 20 years, but it's growth without jobs, right? So as a result, we're seeing increasing informalization. You know, in India, even the government says 80% of the labor force is informal, right? They don't have labor contracts. They don't have legal protections. They're not unionized. They don't have collective bargaining rights. It's precarity and low wages. And then there are various UN estimates, and these are always a little bit tricky because slum data is really problematic. But there are estimates that 43% of the population of global South cities live in slums, live in informality. So the big challenge, under what circumstances might it be possible for urban governance to actually coordinate these patterns of growth with an increasing degree of inclusion? So to think this through, I'm a political sociologist, and political sociologists are a little different from political scientists because when we think about democracy, we think not just about elections. Of course, elections are important, representation, the institutional infrastructure of modern democracies, but we also think about citizenship, about the actual capacity of citizens to use their civic and political rights to demand what? To demand social rights, right? So there's a huge literature on this. Henri Lefebvre was the great French theorist of citizenship, Charles Tilly, who was here at Columbia for many years, Margaret Summers. And they all argue that citizenship isn't just a status. It's not just about a bunch of constitutional rights. It's about the actual practices through which citizens use those rights, or what I call effective citizenship. And those practices are really constituted at the interface of state and civil society. And what that means, I hopefully will become clearer as I develop this argument. And that inclusive citizenship, cities in which citizens can actually make demands on local government and secure some social rights, is part of a larger phenomenon that beginning with Lefebvre and social movement and urbanist theorists in Brazil in particular have coined the right to the city, right? Having a right to the city. And again, I'll expand on that as I go along. Now, having said that, most cities are what I call ration. That the logic of a city, people move to cities because there's opportunity. There's greater freedoms in principle. It's not always true, but in principle. And so cities are spaces of opportunity. But by the same token, the incumbents, those who are already in the city, have a stake, have an incentive in rationing access to the city, producing, in effect, exclusive forms of citizenship. Only some actually have a right to the city. And there's lots of mechanisms that work here, but very broadly, housing markets, right? You have to literally buy your way into the city. And everything in New York City is overpriced, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard to buy your way into the city, especially in the housing market. There are mechanisms of discrimination, think redlining, think ghettos, and I'll give you some examples from the global South. So there's intergroup discrimination, and then government policies themselves. We often think of government as mediating or addressing or attenuating the market-based effects of increasing inequality, and yet sometimes it's governments themselves that are increasing inequality. And I'll give you some examples. And this rationing of the space of access to the city produces these very entrenched patterns of what the Brazilians call differentiated citizenship. Different people in the city have different rights to basic services. And again, I'll give you examples. And then lots of segregation. So much so that where you live in the city more or less determines the kind of basic services you have access to. All right, so how do we get out of this? One possibility are more democratic urban regimes. Right? The three cases I'm talking about are all democracies. So there's at least the possibility that through electoral mechanisms, through mobilization of civil society, through other democratic processes, cities themselves could develop more inclusive policy. But for them to be able to do that, a number of things have to fall into place. So one, you need, and this just comes from the developmental state literature, but you need capacity, right? States need personnel, they need bureaucracies, they need line departments, they need resources, right? So, and capacity is not something you can take for granted. They need what I call political sovereignty. And why this is so important should become clear as I develop the comparative argument. But in order for cities to address complex social problems and promote inclusion, they have to have some authority. They have to have some actual decision-making authority. And they have to be able to make those decisions independently of the federal government or the state level government, which has a different set of incentives. They, among other things, have to develop a certain degree of coordination across line departments, right? So you have different departments doing different things. And as you'll see in the case of India in particular, it's often very challenging to make those departments work together, which is why you either need good planners who actually have the powers to coordinate line departments, or strong executives, strong, powerful mayors that can, through political mechanisms, encourage greater coordination. Okay, that's pretty standard poli-sci governance literature stuff. The World Bank, everyone would sort of agree on this. Not particularly controversial. As a sociologist who thinks democracy is about more than just representation and good institutions, but also about the role of civil society, I and many other sociologists have been using this term embeddedness, which comes from Polanyi. There's a long lineage of thinking around embeddedness. And it's the idea that governance structures work best when they're actually linked or connected to citizens, and citizens can practice, they can use and leverage their citizenship in making claims on the city. And this raises two questions. How broad and binding is citizenship? So first of all, where is the state? And there are slums in Delhi where literally the only time people ever see the state is when the police come by, and that's it. In terms of public service delivery and representatives, et cetera, they can't find the state. The surface area of the state is very, very limited. So you have to be able to find the state and engage with it as a bearer of rights. And then what is the mode of engaging with the state? Are you engaging as a supplicant? Are you begging? Are you a subject? Are you a client? Or are you a citizen demanding rights, the fulfillment of your rights? Right, so the surface area of the state and the mode of engagement become critical. All right, so what's the basis for comparing Brazil, India, and South Africa? So first, these are all obviously post-colonial societies that have inherited deep legacies of inequality, beginning with the whole logic of colonialism is differentiated citizenship. The colonizer has full citizenship, the subjects have lesser forms of citizenship. but that is a still very present legacy of colonial rule in these countries. It may no longer be legal or officially enforced, but the practices, as you will see through many examples, are de facto practices of differentiated citizenship. All of these cities, the big mega cities of the global South, are incredibly unequal. There's massive spatialized inequality. There's the whole center periphery logic. You know, the center tends to be nice and it's green and there's good public transport and services. And then the further you get out into the peripheries, the fewer services and amenities available. And this is the same contrast between formal and informal. And again, I have maps to show you this. And then oftentimes we lose sight of the fact that colonialism was about extraction through a highly centralized authority called the state, in which the only form of authority that was devolved below the level of the central state to cities or states was what Mamdani calls decentralized despotism, right? You empowered chiefs or power brokers or, you know, this isn't democratic empowerment. This is empowering some local broker who does the business of the state. And those legacies, I would argue, are still very powerful in the global South. In fact, I go so far as to say that the single biggest development challenge of the global South is overcoming the legacy of weak local government. Here in the, you know, in the Western world, the advanced democratic world, I'm from Switzerland, you know, we take strong local government for granted. Strong local government in the global South is the exception to the North. And one of the exceptions, as you will see, is Brazil. So on the one hand, you have these tremendous legacies of the colonial period, structured inequality, spatialized inequality, decentralized despotism. On the other hand, Brazil makes the transition back to democracy in '84. You know, India's been democratic, obviously, since '48. South Africa finally overcomes apartheid, becomes a democracy in 1994. And since then, these are the three most successful consolidated democracies in the global South. There are no others. Indonesia, sort of, but it's complicated. It's not that democratic. But these are the three largest. They all have really vibrant civil societies because they have basic democratic freedoms of civic and political organizing and tremendous inequality. So a range of associations, movements, NGOs, CBOs are mobilized in all three and have been, especially at the time of transition, to lesser degrees today, but that resource was there. All three introduced decentralization reforms in the 1990s. And I'll talk about each case separately, but it's quite significant constitutional reforms empowering the third tier of government, right? So you've got your center, you've got your states, and then you've got your cities or rural local governments. And those were all empowered in the 1990s. And in principle, they all used, in making these amendments, they all used the language of participatory democracy, right? We want more open, vibrant local democratic arenas for decision-making. All right, and I'm gonna go fast because I have a lot of slides. So, you know, one basic metric is services, the most basic of service, water, you know, and a place to go to the bathroom, right? Really important. And if you look at this data, you know, Brazil is pretty much at a level of universal coverage. And this includes Salvador. So Rio and Sao Paulo are, you know, big, vibrant, powerful cities. Salvador is in the Northeast. It's overwhelmingly, it's one of the least economically developed cities in Brazil. It's also the one that has the greatest legacies of the slave-based plantation economy. And yet, even in Salvador, they have delivered services to everyone. South Africa and India, not so good, right? And they're about roughly equal, but nowhere near the same levels as Brazil. Policy. So you could talk about policies for slums, in situ development of slums, and you can talk about low-income housing. These are the things the urban poor really, you know, need the most. Again, India, lots of policies. The Indian government is constantly generating new policies for, they used to call it slum clearance. Now they call it slum improvement, and they haven't really improved anything. I spent years doing this research in Delhi. We could find no successful cases of successful in situ slum redevelopment, extremely rare. Low-income housing, not too successful there either. The housing, to the extent that it is subsidized by government policies, usually goes to the middle class, at best the lower middle class, is certainly not servicing those who live in slums and informal settlements. South Africa made the transition again in 1994. Only 3 years ago did they actually put together a set of policies to address the problem of informal shack settlements that is pervasive in all the big cities. And so far, very limited implementation. They did have a massive housing program when the ANC first came to power in 94. It's called RDP Housing. They built 4 million units through strictly market mechanisms, meaning you build the units where you can afford the land, which means you build the units on the periphery of the city. And the spatial form of the apartheid city is already one of peripheralization of Black people. Now they're even more peripheralized. Moreover, they didn't work with community groups. It was very top-down, technocratic process. Almost no integration with transport policies, education policies, infrastructure delivery, et cetera. So you literally have housing units on the periphery that don't have service, right? So that's largely been a failure. Brazil regularized through constitutional mechanisms and then other forms of legislation, all informal settlement. So anyone in informal settlement today in Brazil technically has a path to regularization through the courts. Lots of policy tools that have been developed for in situ development of slums, many of which were developed in conjunction with movements, many of which, and again, tremendous variation across Brazilian cities, but cities like Sao Paulo, Rio, Salvador, Bahia have all actually done quite well in terms of upgrading slums. Housing program, a bit similar to South Africa in the sense that it's through market mechanisms. Called Minha Casa, Minha Vida. This was started under the first Worker Party government in 2002. It's had some impact, especially for the lower middle class, not so much for the truly urban poor, right? So limited success on that front, but at least the slums have been significantly upgraded. So I want to give you a preview. I'm going to go now into the actual comparisons and the larger argument, and I'll show you this slide again. But the argument is that the outcome in India, because of capacity governance and embeddedness, is what Partha Mukhopadhyay and I call the growth cabal. So Indian cities are dominated by a growth logic, but it's not even well coordinated. It's a cabal as opposed to a machine. So things get developed all the time to maximize returns to land values, but there's not very good coordination in terms of infrastructures, right? So you get whole new cities that emerge and don't have sewage systems, for example. In South Africa, it's more of an actual growth machine, right? So South African cities have expanded rapidly in the periphery. There's malls and new developments, et cetera, all pushed by land developers, but it's somewhat coordinated with local municipal government, right? So you get the infrastructure, but again, a deep neglect of the needs of the urban poor and those living in townships and informal settlements. Brazil, of course, has developers. It has land markets. It's also a default growth machine logic, and standing up to land developers and land markets is always tricky in an open democratic capitalist economy. But the Brazilians have been able to significantly expand the reach of the developmental state and to create what I should say, more of a social city, one that's actually inclusive. So let me turn to some of this data. India has not had a census since 2011, largely for political reasons. So the data is not very good. Colleagues of mine at Brown with collaborators in India have been collecting data from 14 Indian cities since 2022. And these are just the slum numbers we put together. And note that our numbers are slightly higher than the census numbers, which means either we have different methodologies, ways of counting slums, or the slums are actually growing, and it's impossible to know. But the point is, big cities like Kolkata, 31% live in slums. Delhi's the lowest at 16 among the super big cities. I hope you can read these names. Chennai is Madras in the south, 30%, Hyderabad, 35%, and then Mumbai just off the charts, right? 60% of this city of 20 million people live in slums, and these are real slums. Our definition of slum is to go there and see it, and we have a whole set of criteria. So when we say it's a slum, right? So limited services, et cetera, precarious housing, the whole thing. So clearly, India still has a monumental problem. So what's going on in Indian cities? First, they're growing incredibly rapidly. 2011, 370 million people in India live in cities. Now, India's definition of urbanization is a bit odd and different from others. So it's probably a conservative number, but the growth is surreal. By 2020, 600 million people will live in Indian cities. That's the EU and the United States together. The increase alone is the size of the United States. So think of taking the entire population of the United States and cramming it into Indian cities in a 30-year period, right? That's the challenge going forward. There's been lots of growth, economic growth, but it's mostly what economists call rent-thick growth. It's not new productive capacity in industry. This isn't China, exporting all over the world. This is returns on land, extractive industries, and brokerage fees. And I could get into that, but it's not creating a lot of jobs. Infrastructure is just not keeping up. China, on average, spends 10 times more than India does on developing urban infrastructure. There's still lots of land rationing going on, new slums, new unauthorized colonies, right? So literally the government, municipal governments are not providing enough housing or enough land for development. So people just invade the land, right? And usually with the help of, illicit developers, et cetera, but these are called unauthorized colonies. So spatial inequality, and this is a project I did with the Center for Policy Research. It was an 8-year project doing field work in the slums of Delhi. We called it Cities of Delhi, and I'll show you why. So to me, this one electricity bill sums up the entire problem of inclusion in Indian cities. And this is quite unique. So this is the gentleman has lived there for 30 years. It's a slum. It's called the JJC, Jogi Jogpuri. It's essentially, this is the JJ, a bunch of shacks. He does get electricity, very strong patronage politician locally. But look at what this says, and only the Indian bureaucracy, and there's lots of good things from the Indian bureaucracy, but they can come up with this kind of language. Temporary arrangement without confirming any legal right. You can pay your bill, but you are not a citizen. And this shows up in official data. So these are, and Phil's here, and others may know Delhi, you have settlement types. And this is, again, a legacy of colonialism, right? And, this is the official government data, the different settlements. So this is the most informal. This is the most planned. In planned areas, you have everything. It's legal. It's fine. You get all the services. Access to water is good. Just use water as an example. In Jogi Jogpuris, you have close to 2.5 million people. It's illegal. It's unplanned. And you don't even have a right to water, right? And then I have to point out, I've seen this table reproduced in umpteen published articles, et cetera. And maybe because I stared at it for so long, I realized that some of these numbers are identical, which statistically is impossible, right? I mean, this is totally impossible. So they're cooking these numbers. So this is abundantly clear. They don't really know what's going on, but there's a lot of differentiation. So we put a map together. This is another team. This is using satellite imaging and machine learning. And we actually went and categorized all 4,350 settlements in Delhi, et cetera. So this is kind of all the rural stuff, light orange, so you should ignore it before the city is here. And you can see how segregated it is by neighborhood type, right? The green is the nice, literally leafy planned areas that have all the services. And then the other colors are, again, different types of settlements. This is the same map broken down by type. What's really striking is this is the planned stuff. This is where we would all live, if we were in Delhi, where the upper middle class lives. Yeah, it's really nice parks, good services, everything. What's really stunning is where the shacks are. Shacks are right next to the planned areas. Why? Because upper middle class people in Delhi need servants. And you can't have them living 2 hours away. So they live in shacks, and this is the spatial pattern of the city. And all the new stuff, whether it's unauthorized or regularized, tends to run. And then when the city itself displaces people into resettlement colonies, displace them to the periphery. So that's the spatial logic of inequality in Indian cities. This is one of these planned settlements. This is a government planned settlement. They built all this housing for 70,000 people, and there's no running water. So they rely on tanker trucks. And politicians, by the way, love tanker trucks because they can put their names on it. You can't put your name on running water, but you can put your name on a tanker truck. It'd be perfect patronage good. All right, and this just shows statistical correlation, bunch of stuff. But again, informal settlements, index of, this is a huge index. It's banking infrastructure, transport, water, et cetera. Huge differences and informal settlements. And I apologize for going fast, but I want to make sure I get through all my cases. So what's the problem? Cities without power, which is a terrible subtitle because Indian cities have electricity. This is the one service that's universal. What they don't have is political power. They are cities without a state. Indian city, think of it, Mumbai has 20 million people. The mayor of Mumbai, nobody knows the name of the mayor of Mumbai or the mayor of Delhi or the mayor of India. They have no power. The cities are run by state-appointed commissioners. It's the state of Maharashtra who appoints an IAS officer to run the city of Mumbai. Most of the agencies in the city, including the most important ones, police, planning, land management, water, sewage, tend to be state-level bureaucracies. Mumbai is a bit of an exception, but this is more than most. Elected councils rarely meet. They make no policy because they have no legislative authority. Right? Indian cities cannot pass laws. New York can pass laws. Indian cities cannot. Limited fiscal resources. Because of all of this, massive coordination problems, a lot of institutional fragmentation. One department, the water department, doesn't know what the sewage department's doing, which doesn't know what the slum redevelopment department is doing. All sorts of perverse incentives. If you're a politician in an Indian city, you can't deliver policy. So what do? You deliver patronage. Right? I'll get you a bus stop or fix your lamps, et cetera, quid pro quo for votes. That's nice, you know, but that's not programmatic. That's not what's going to happen in the city. The dominance of rent-seeking interests, it's all about the land developers. And the politicians are all making money through deal-making over urban land to mostly fund their urban electoral machines, right? Not to invest in the city. Appadurai, great Indian anthropologist, coined the term citizens without a city. Citizens in India, in urban India, they have the right to vote at all levels, but they're only heard at the central and the state level. At the city level, their vote really doesn't matter, right? Because their representatives can't actually do anything. So there's all sorts of differentiated legalities, as you've seen in the case of Delhi. There's no real space to interface with the state in urban India. Civil society, and it exists, tends to be dominated by middle-class interests. You know, so they want to clean up the informal sector because it doesn't look nice, because it's messy, because it's noisy. But those are the hawkers of the slums, you know, who are being evicted, et cetera. So civil society organizations tend to be classified. And overall, there's just a complete misalignment of institutional power and political authorization. By politics, the right of representatives and officials to intervene in public matters is being authorized at the center and the state level, but not at the city level, right? So there's this massive misalignment. I have to be attentive to my time. South Africa. And I'm going to go through this one very quickly because I got to get to Brazil. Otherwise, you're just going to be left with a very pessimistic view of the future of the urban global South. So South Africa is really interesting because unlike most post-colonial societies, it inherited a high capacity state. So when Mandela becomes president, when the ANC comes to power in 1994, they inherit the apartheid state. And the apartheid state has tremendous, if you're going to segregate people by 4 different races across all walks of life, from jobs to marriage to consumption to where they live, you need a ton of capacity, like bureaucratic capacity, capillary capacities, et cetera. And this is what the ANC inherits, including taxation. South Africa has one of the most robust tax states in the global South. And it has tremendous inequality. So progressive taxation means you're basically taxing whites to provide services for blacks. So this is an ideal set of circumstances. There's a huge political mandate. You have black majority government, undoing apartheid, or as the ANC like to say, deracializing the highly racially segregated. The South African Constitution has all these provisions for decentralization, for local participation in government, and for progressive taxation. So again, really an ideal set of circumstances. You've got a stable programmatic governing coalition, the ANC, the African Congress, but most of their policies in terms of housing and formal settlement have failed. The infrastructure development has been driven more by a growth logic. It's literally a coalition of ANC officials and developers making a lot of money through new development projects. And if anything, we think spatial inequality is actually increasing. So this is your classic apartheid city, Durban, South Africa. It's a port city, the largest here, 1996, just when apartheid ended, where whites live. And look at it. I mean, you know, this is the most extreme form of planned, organized racial differentiation ever developed in society in the world. The whites, all the coast, it's beautiful. You can go surfing, it's parks, whatnot. The highlands, this is the highway to Joburg. That's where the whites live. Indians live here. Blacks live out. That was the classic racialized form of the apartheid city. So undoing this is obviously a major challenge. We collected and coded GIS data from the 2001 census. And what you see, so this is the famous Soweto part of the apartheid, where all the and the north is white, south is black, the mines you see here, political economy. What you see over a relatively short period of time is that black professionals, because there were some black professionals, educated, engineers, teachers, nurses, doctors, they all move into the city. Black becomes racially less segregated, but class-wise much more segregated. This is an index we developed. It's the Developmental State Capacity Index. So what kind of capacity does the state, as measured by its ability to deliver health, education, water, sewage, and electricity, how much capacity is there at the subplace level? Census construct subplace. You can see incredibly uneven, right? And again, north-south pattern, but even within the north, there's unevenness. And it turns out this is all correlated with race, where blacks are, where colored people are, so-called Asian people, et cetera. So again, despite democracy, despite efforts to dismantle the racial state, tremendous inequality in local service. This is just what's called hotspot. It's just a statistical verification of what we saw earlier, because of the massive, statistically verified inequality in service delivery, and it's all north-south. Okay, so what happened in South Africa? My argument is that even though everything was well aligned to be somewhat successful in unmaking the apartheid city, strong programmatic party, lots of democratic legitimacy, resources, capacity, the problem became the ANC itself. The ANC quickly demobilized the civil society sector that had brought it to power. It made itself the gatekeeper of all development and resource and service delivery. They did quite a bit of delivery, but without much participation. So it ends up being more patronage type delivery than programmatic delivery. We know this is a huge problem because for the last 20 years, and this is an ongoing trend in South Africa, almost every day, the press reports what they call service delivery protests. So these are, local activists protesting problems with water, electricity, flooded streets, et cetera. And their line is the right to be taken seriously, right? But the majority party, the ANC, it doesn't take them that seriously. So what's happened? I think it's a classic growth machine. There's an alliance between the ANC and white capital, and in particular real estate capital. The developers really dominate the transformation of the city. So South Africa, it's malls everywhere. Now, most people in South Africa don't have the means to go to the malls, and yet malls have driven much of the development. New exclusive gated communities with dedicated golf courses and other facilities, et cetera. And South Africa is a beautiful country, lots of beautiful resources, and the developers have really taken advantage of that. And some of the elites of the ANC live in these communities. That's where a lot of the development has gone, lots of mega projects. And this is really just a city and going against the grain of the larger project to de-racialize apartheid city. All right, I'm on to my last case. Bear with me. I have 7 minutes, 8 minutes. So Brazil, and this is to end, on a positive note. Important to be positive, especially given this is Tuesday and a week from now there'll be a Tuesday, and Anyway, so state capacity. So the Brazilian cities look just like South African Indian cities in terms of inequality, spatial inequality, et cetera. Because of the legacies of colonialism, up until the democratic period, they were dominated by local, literally different families govern different cities, oligarchical families. Built these huge patronage machines that delivered resources, but on a patronage basis. And then you get this transition to democracy, and I'll say more about it in the next slide. But a turning point was the '88 Constitution. So, like any constitution, this is made by politicians, but social movements played a huge role in shaping the '88 Constitution. And one of the things they pushed for, these are urban social movements, they're union allies, these are anti-racism groups, the LGBT community, the public health community, they really pushed for decentralization. They wanted cities to have resources, authority, and capacities to address development issues. And in doing so, they really promoted participation, and I'll give you examples. In this new politics of a new citizenship, right? We're all Brazilians, we all have a right to the city, and those rights include civic, political, but also social rights. And this was literally the discourse and the animating project of these movements in the 1980s. So they get this constitution, which is, most jurists think this is the most progressive rights-based constitution in the world. The result is what I call development in the city. I mean, Brazil itself is developing at the time, but it's really in the cities that you're seeing dramatic increases, in particular in investing in the periphery, right? So all the urban poor, all the migrant workers who are predominantly brown or black, it's a racially divided society. They live in the so-called periphery where historically it was informal, they didn't have services, now they're getting services. So Brazil today, unlike the United States, has universal health care. The SUS system is universal and it gets into every favela, every informal settlement. It's free health care. Not super at the high end, maybe, but in terms of primary health care, superb. And effective it's been. Bolsa Familia, which is maybe the most successful conditional cash transfer program anywhere in the world. This is money into the hands of the female, it's to women or whoever is in charge of the household, and it's just a direct cash transfer. The condition was you got to send your kids to school and they have to get vaccinated. Hugely successful. It's brought poverty down significantly. There's lots of World Bank data on this. I think most importantly, they regularized land precarity. So all these people living in informal settlements who don't have formal property rights have now been able to property, as well as develop some low-income housing and develop increasing reach of basic services, water delivery to the. So in general, you see an expansion of what I call the social state at the metro level. And here's the data to prove it. You guys know what the HDI index is? This is the Amartya Sen, the World Bank. Development isn't just growth, it's also human development. So the HDI index is a composite index, literacy, infant mortality, growth, and life expectancy. Good to be alive, and to have good health, et cetera. Very, very low is what Brazil was in '91, which is pretty much where India was at the time. I mean, not a huge difference. And you see a few pockets, Sao Paulo, Rio, southern cities. And I love this effect. 10 years later, this is a sticky, what we call a sticky variable. It's hard to move the HDI. It takes a lot of time, right? In the US, it's actually fallen a little bit because of lowered life expectancy. But so you see, it's not surprising, the South is much more industrialized. This is the old sugar-based plantation economy where labor was concentrated. The South is whiter, more economically developed. And you jump forward, and by 2010, this is after 10 years of the PT, the Workers' Party being in power, so you're starting to get European levels. In the north, for us, the most economically marginalized part of Brazil is significantly catching up. This is city level data. So there's a general effect, sure, but a lot of this is because cities are delivering healthcare, right? Infant mortality, which is the most important statistic if you're thinking about development. You get infant mortality down, all the other measures go up. Infant mortality is about nurses. It's about clean water. It's about having health clinics in every village, every community, every favela, every. That's what municipalities, right? The government, the central government may pay for it, but the weakest link in the chain of delivery is always local government. If local government can't get it done, it's not going to happen. So clearly, the strengthening of municipalities in Brazil has had a huge effect. So what's the larger story? The larger story, and this is the political sociology, you have a pincer movement in the 70s and 80s. So on the one hand, there's this massive civil society mobilization against the dictatorship and for social rights with the language of citizenship. And at the same time, and as part of that mobilization, you get a bunch of institutional reform. So I already mentioned 88 Constitution. There's also the City Statute of 2001. And for those of you who are urban planners, this is a document that says every city has to have an urban plan. And this is how it has to look. And here are the resources to get it done. And it has to include land and services and health. And it's incredibly comprehensive. Difficult to enforce, as all planners know, but you got to have a plan. Some cities have plans. They also have secure federal transfers. The Constitution, simple provision says every municipality gets X percentage share of the federal government. This is non-negotiable. Politicians can't touch it. So all the health and education transfers and a lot of the basic social services are formulaic, regulated federal transfers to cities. Brazilian cities have more resources and more decision-making authority than any cities in Latin America. There's a huge comparative literature on this. Nobody. So how did this actually come about? I argue the key is having a balance between political and civil society. So political society is parties and politicians. The parties about I'm one of the people I went canvassing the other day, and like half the people say, I hate politicians. I'm not voting for everyone. I like politics. I think politicians are really important, right? But politicians want, they want to win. And when they're in power, they want to stay in power. And staying in power usually means sort of figuring out where's the electoral majority and making sure the electoral majority that got you into power gets what they want, right? That's what we call patronage. So you got to balance the power of politicians and their innate predilection for patronage with something else, with movements demanding that things be delivered on the basis of rights, not patronage, not being subject, not being a client, but basis of rights. And what Brazil's been able to do since the 80s and maintain some balance between political society and civil society, including when the PT, so the PT is the Workers' Party led by Lula. Lula grew up in the favelas. He's a union guy. He represents these movements. The PT is one of the rare parties in the world that really is a social movement party. But, they were in power for 16 years. When you're in power for 16 years, the iron law of oligarchy and all these other tendencies towards centralizing authority kick in. And every time they went a little too far in terms of just supporting what was good for the party and not what was good necessarily for society, you get the movements who push back, who go back into the policies and critique them, et cetera, and cycle in and out of government and are constantly holding the government to account. So the movements engage with the state without losing their autonomy. Citizenship has been strengthened over time, and there's great survey data on this. When you ask Brazilians, why do you get X, Y, and Z? They all say, because it's my right. Remember, even in the United States, this is a novel question. I remember when Obama and McCain were competing for the presidency, this was a debate question. Is healthcare a right? This is like the only country in the world that I know where you could still ask that question. In Brazil, you don't ask that question. Healthcare is a right. Service delivery is a right, et cetera. And this is a huge break with the clientelism of the past. And what you have at the local level is what sociologists following Polanyi would say is an embedded local state. It has high capacity, it has some autonomy, but it's embedded in civil society through picture of the book I showed you earlier was the book we did on participatory budgeting. 500 cities in Brazil have public assemblies where the people, the citizens, the mobilized civil society come and make the budget. So not just the politicians, not just the backdoor dealing, not just the deals with developers, but actual civil society organizations make the budget. There's a whole set of sectoral councils and other participatory mechanisms. So people have called this council democracy. There's the city statute, which mandates participation in planning. And in the broadest sense of the term, you have an expanded surface area of the state in every policy arena, child services, healthcare, delivery of basic infrastructure, public transport. The state can be engaged with by organized proactive citizens. And this in turn allows for new forms of co-production. And this is Elinor Ostrom, first woman to win the Nobel Prize and a political scientist. She won it in economics. She coined the term co-production. She says, when you're delivering complex things like education and health, you need the state working with communities, working with constituents, with parents, with the nursing in order to deliver. And that's what's known as co-production. But co-production requires institutional mechanisms. And Brazilian states have a lot of them. I'm running out of time, so I'll just show you one slide. This is data that Roberto Pires put together. So this is the measured level of participation across literally over 1,000 cities. Classified them as low intent, or high intent. What he finds pretty clear from raw numbers, more participation you have, the more state personnel you get. Right, so people participate, they make demands on the local state, the state starts hiring more nurses, there's more architects, there's a real positive dynamic taking place here. All right, so this is the summarized summary of the argument. I will come back to this, but I'll just finish with these 5 big points and then I promise I'll stop. So, you know, given the larger literature in urban studies and theory that's quite pessimistic about prospects for democratic development in cities because everything's overdetermined by the structural needs of global capital, et cetera. I want to make the case that democracy can make a difference. Politics does matter. There's obvious variation between Brazil, South Africa, and India. Within Brazil, there's tremendous variation, right? Some cities are literally controlled by drug cartels, you know, others are democratic and mobilized and organized. But again, democracy is different. Despite inequality and global pressures, it is possible to develop some forms of more inclusive democratic governance. A key here is the relationship between the center and the local, which we just don't pay enough attention to. It's kind of boring, you know, but if the center or the state level control everything, cities are never going to be good at being more inclusive. Representation is great. It's the sine qua non of democracy, but it's not enough. You also need a vibrant civil society. The ideal local state is deeply embedded in civil society itself. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions and go back to any slide you just looked at. There's something buzzing here. Yeah. Yeah. And how they I mean, in both sides. If there's no that okay, yes. Okay, yeah, no, those are absolutely fantastic questions. So, look, in general, irrespective of who's in power in Delhi and India, political class, whether it's the left or the right, not interested. They're not interested in decentralization because they know how to organize. They don't want to devolve it to all class of politicians who might push for. And part of it is that I mentioned, and Harsh and others have argued that, but the money's in the city, the there was huge progress in the government before him on rights-based law. And Reagan guarantees there's an expansion. That's it. And I know because I heard a lot about this and I've worked with some of the architects in Riga. They understood that this is a work program. Basically, every rural worker in India, labor paid, above sort of rates. We know it's had huge welfare effect. Architects understood it so democratic. They knew that that money would all disappear if they didn't build up. And Modi is now you get an app, you get your money, and it's from the great leader Modi, right? I call it the neo-patriarchal. Bolsonaro tried to do exactly. He, all these cities and Paris, this and that, and he but the institutions are because they're 5,000 members. He got no. Eventually, but there's no doubt nationalist governments tend to want to definitely not good evolving in democracy. Yes, or are you? No, sorry.
But like acting like celebrate, etc.
Yeah.
And that uh, uh and amazing.
You should write a book on this. No, I'm dead serious because I should have mentioned gender. I think it's really important. So the way you just represented the Brazilian case, I think is exactly right. So their neighborhood-based movements in Brazil historically were controlled by local strongmen who had patronage ties to the local dominant oligarchical scene. The 70s and 80s literally saw those guys displaced by women's associations representing the interests of the favela. And their interest was in universal access to healthcare, universal benefits, et cetera. So the women's movement was absolutely central to the more pro-social logic of these movements in the 70s and 80s. And especially in healthcare, the sanitarista movement, which is what drove the public healthcare movement. A lot of that is doctors, which were overwhelmingly male, but a lot of the foot soldiers were nurses, who are almost all women. And the community healthcare programs in Brazil, there's tons of literature on this. If it weren't for feminism and women's participation, they wouldn't be what they are today. I wanted and this is going to be a bit of a stretch, but I want to go ahead and do it in any way. There's one city in India that doesn't really have slums, Kochi, which is a big port city in the state of Kerala. The state of Kerala itself is famous for its social development indicators, which are probably the best anywhere in the global south. 30 million people, so it's the size of California. And the usual story, including the story I've told, is the left comes to power, programmatic reforms. It's a communist party. They're not really communists, they're social democratic, but don't tell them that because they hate it when you say that. But they really are social democratic. Anyway, so they did all this good stuff. But it's clear the first thing they did was female literacy. And almost everything, declining fertility, better health care, lower income, started with female literacy. And that was started by a literacy campaign, which was led by women and had all these knock-on effects over it. So yes, you could tell, and one should tell, a very a powerful story about feminism and gender politics and explaining these out. So thank you for that question. Yeah.
Is
Yeah, so first, and I just didn't have time to say this. I mean, we have to be careful. Decentralization by itself, is not a magic solution to all these problems, right? You wouldn't, the Jim Crow South was highly decentralized. And it was through the decentralized Jim Crow South that a regime of white supremacy was reproduced for, almost a century, right? So you have to decentralize, but with minimum standards and some regulation. So the danger with decentralization is always what they call local capture. So you could decentralize a lot of authority and resources and decision-making to Indian cities, and it would just be captured by the developer cabal and oligarchy, and things could be even worse, right? So it has to be democratic decentralization, with clear checks and balances and sort of minimum standards and rights, et cetera. Explaining why Brazil, I'm actually trying to write a book on this, and I say trying because I think it's really hard. When we talk about state, there's a huge state formation literature, and it's all about the center. It's never about local government, which I think is a real problem, because strong states, the most decentralized states in the world are the Scandinavian states. And the most successful development models in the world in terms of growth and inclusion and innovation are the Scandinavian states. And we always think of them as these big centralized social democratic regimes, but 60% of all expenditures in Sweden are at the local level, right? It takes a long time to build these systems and the political dynamics. So I think in India, the problem is the political machine. That the Congress Party itself, and Phil knows more about this than anyone in the world, but it was a very powerful machine. And at every state level, so Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, wherever, they build these machines, and the center transfers resources, and the states has some of its own, but they've really sort of monopolized power and resource allocation. And given the way post-independence democracy in India has evolved, there have been few opportunities to sort of dismantle those centers of power. In Brazil, what happened was the authoritarian regime. Because when the military came back to power in '64, so again, this is getting deep into the weeds, et cetera, but Brazil was a kind of semi-democracy in the '60s, and then the left got mobilized, and the US said, enough with this, and the CIA and everyone, and the Brazilian military came to power, and they just shut everything down. But they shut the machines down because they wanted to control everything from above. And so for 20 years, the machines were kind of quiet. And then you get the rise of these civil society groups. And when democracy opens up again, of course, the machines come right back. But now they're confronting this really organized civil society, which includes the new political party called the Workers' Party, which is not a patronage machine, but a programmatic social development. That's sorry, that's a bit, a lot, but I'm still trying to figure this out because it's fantastic, very complicated. Val? Yeah. 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 No, that's a really important question. George Orwell once said, we'll never get socialism because people don't want to be obedient. And just talk to faculty in American academia, they all bitch, sorry, they all complain. about going to meetings, and I always said, well, what's the alternative? You want bureaucratic authoritarian rule? You know, if you want to self-govern, you got to go to the damn meetings, you got to do the work. But asking poor people in the urban peripheries to go to meetings all the time, we'd all love to see everyone participating on a daily basis in advancing their social rights, et cetera. But of course, it's not realistic. And the Brazilian case, there was this heyday in the 80s, maybe the early 2000s, where there was a ton of participation. And since then, it's become much more institutional. There's specialized NGOs, community-based organizations. There's all sorts of other modes of intermediation that have emerged. And there's a huge literature in Brazil, and I think it's super sophisticated. The social movement literature has always said institutionalization, end of mobilization. That is not true. I mean, look at Scandinavia. When's the last time Swedish workers went on strike? They're actually striking against Musk and Tesla right now, but they haven't really gone on strike for 30 years. And they don't go on strike because their wages get negotiated every year through corporatist arrangements with the government. They don't need to go on strike because their interests have been institutionalized, right? So institutionalization does not have to come at the expense of mobilization participation, although it can, for sure. And so for me, it's a bit of an empirical question. And some of the research I've done in Sao Paulo, worked with students in a favela, and they don't do a lot of mobilizing anymore. But oh my God, the density of NGOs in that community, most of them run by young people and most run by women with a lot of LGBTQ and trans people, et cetera. They're on top of everything, right? Every time there's a new policy, they've got data, they've done their own research, they're engaged. So it's not protest and contestation and 1,000 people showing a civic meeting, but it is a lot of very sophisticated, highly professionalized local activists who know how to work the system, right? So again, it's a fantastic question, and one shouldn't exaggerate the returns on participation, should never underestimate how difficult it is. We also have to pay attention to how participation itself can change the way governments respond to $1 billion, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 So again, a fantastic follow-up question. And I hate to self-promote, but we wrote this, but we did. So we studied 8 cases of participatory budgeting that were not Porto Alegre because everyone else studied Porto Alegre. And we found tremendous variation. And it depends, the outcome depends on how strong society is, but also how carefully. The budget, the share of the budget goes anywhere from totally symbolic to 30. But even when it's not a big share of the budget, what it does is it's a lot greater budget making process. So even if the citizens at the end of the day aren't saying, don't have the final word in allocating, the process requires much greater back and getting a whole bunch of active and shaping. So that said, politicians are always looking for ways, weapons. And this is why the watchword when you always autonomy. Can you engage without ultimately sacrificing resistance from projects? That's really difficult. All movements face this challenge at some point. But again, that's an empirical. And this varies. Some cities will way more participants than others. I have 2 undergrads right now looking at for budgeting city in the Amazonia. there was just one group that's proactive in the budget just by
And and the kitchen, the legacy, and also having a little more cost. of the- And thank you to everyone. And have a talk, after.